Good evening, I'm Greer McGeary, President of Seahorse Victoria, and my guest tonight is Kenna Morrison. Welcome, Kenna.
Thank you, Greer. Good to be here.
What I'd probably like to start with is the present. So where are you at the moment in your life?
I'm a transgender woman. At the end of last year, I retired and have spent most of this year growing into being myself. Much more than I have been able to do previously.
When did you first know that you were sort of something different in you?
Probably once I started going to school, I realised I was different to other people. I had no idea what or how or whatever. And that sort of stayed with me right through school. An interesting sort of background story is that my parents separated. My mother left my violent father when she was 6 months pregnant with me. Then I was born with her support of her family, and then she returned as a doctor to outback New South Wales, a little town called Tottenham, and I spent my first 4 years there, and then we came down to Melbourne, and I grew up in Melbourne and some time in Geelong as well. But one of the curious things, during all that growing up time, I had no significant contact with peer-aged girls.
Well, I suppose being in a very small town to start with in those formative years, I remember when our eldest was just starting to go to school, and then we uprooted where we were living in the Northern Territory, come back to Melbourne. It had a disruptive sort of socialising period of time.
Yeah, we moved probably a little bit before that. And one of the rationales from my mother was that education was better in the big cities than in the bush. And I remember I had a friend who lived across the road that I played with, another boy. Then when we moved to Melbourne, there were a couple of boys in the street we lived in, and then to school. I've got very, very few memories of my first 2 years at school. Then we moved to Geelong and started in a boys' school. Then, as my mother undertook further study, boarded from what's now called Year 7, used to be first form. But needless to say, in a boys' boarding school, I just did not fit. It was a pretty traumatic time. I wasn't athletic. When I first started school, I started off in the dunces grade. Then by the time I was doing Year 12, I was in the second top out of 6 streams.
In that period of being at school, you say you weren't athletic, so you weren't quite fitting in. Was there sort of bullying or that style of activity happening to you?
There wasn't a lot of explicit bullying, but there was a lot of macho culture, which I didn't really feel comfortable with, or I tried to conform because that's all I knew. Yeah. And part of the rationale was my mother decided as a single woman that I needed some masculine influence, which I got, and I learnt to play the role.
So in that period of time where you sort of say, well, you're not fitting in and you're learning to play the role, were you aware that you had an inkling that you would prefer to identify as female? Really,
the first time I had any significant contact with peer-age girls, women, was when I got to university. So the thought hadn't occurred to me. So I had no idea what being a girl would have been like. Yeah. It was just totally foreign to me. And then at university, I got caught up with the evangelical group. I continued to play the role. Did university, a couple of degrees with a year's working between, qualified as a social worker, ended up marrying and having a family with 3 kids.
Before we get on to the family side of it, you mentioned about being caught up in the evangelical sort of thing. I sort of grew up in a Catholic environment. I was rather fortunate. My parents weren't dogmatic. How did you find the evangelical impact on the way you thought?
Going back a little bit, my mother's brought up in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but she never really fitted in there. It was too rigid for her. And through school I found a much more positive, much more flexible connection with the Anglicans. I didn't find it too bad because, of course, I had no idea of gender issues in those days. So the thought didn't occur to me. Unlike many trans people, I didn't identify my self as actually being fundamentally a woman until a bit over 2.5 years ago.
I've described how I felt as this becomes a full extension of me as a person rather than a little being trapped inside trying to get out. Sort of. How did you sort of see your own identity in those early days?
And I was just a quiet person, pretty much a loner. Had very few direct relationships or friends. Raising the family, most of the relationships originated with my wife, and some of those have maintained. Still pretty much a loner. I've got a small group of friends, gaining more since I realised my gender and started feeling more confident in myself.
One of the things, and I've even with my own children, about when you develop the personal confidence in who you are, it's surprising how the world opens up.
Oh yeah. At a professional level, I had been moderately successful. At one point I knew the trip from Launceston to Canberra far too well and rattled around Parliament House from time to time, on both state and federal. But then moved on from there in due course. Yeah,
one of the things I found over my life was being part of a service club because, I suppose very similar to what you were saying about you don't have a lot of really close friends as such, but the notion of a service club type environment because and family groups such as the kids' sporting clubs or something provides social interaction with a lot of people, and I think that was very important to maintain a degree of sanity, as it were, because then you always got purpose to deal with. Now, you've been raising your family.
My kids grew up, they're all now grown, and they left Tasmania and I'd separated. Nothing to do with gender. So I moved back to Melbourne, ended up caring for my mother. She was starting a decline fairly significantly, so I felt a bit of responsibility. Once she passed, I ended up with more time for myself.
What was in thinking about yourself more, so what was the catalyst or the trigger that made you start to realise, hello, I'm not what I thought I was?
YouTube, believe it or not. I was, would occasionally waste some time bouncing around YouTube, and one time I happened upon a video about a person describing their transition from a man to a woman. And I said, oh, that's interesting, and followed a link on that page, then another link on that page, and suddenly I realised, that makes better sense than anything I'd ever tried. And I'd tried all sorts of things to sort of find identity, but that made just so much better sense. And within the space of an hour or two, I realised that I was fundamentally a woman.
So basically the big light bulb went above your head.
It was a big big light bulb moment. I was then very immediately very confident. I then asked the question, am I fooling myself? So I then got a number of appointments with a psychologist, confirmed, is who I am.
You've come to that realisation at that point. What were the sort of mechanisms you put in place to manage the process of from the light bulb moment to your transition?
I was working full time, and so I kept it pretty much to myself. Saw the psychologist a number of times and satisfied both myself and him that yes, I was genuinely a woman in my identity. And looking back, all sorts of big hints that I should have recognised.
I think that's common, isn't it?
Crazy ones like whenever I was watching a film or a movie, TV series, or reading a novel, it was always the women I identified with. Absolutely, never a man. It was always a woman. Again, even before recognising my gender, I came to really dislike body hair and been spending some time and money removing body hair. From the time that I realised until the time that I commenced taking hormones, it was about 6 months.
All the things that I've done in the last 20 years in relation to the likes of Seahorse and being a point of contact, but just in my own development is making sure that I, in the end, was out to all the people who are relevant to me, making sure that you don't burn bridges. You know, it's about having, to me, it's about having a life, and I've never been one to try and burn bridges. Sometimes they probably have burnt accidentally, but not deliberately. But I've seen people who are hurt enormously because they've lost that connection with family and close friends.
And I've been most fortunate that way. I eventually decided that this dual life was not for me, and I needed to come out full time. It was a good deal of experimentation. First episodes of coming out were, other than just to walk around the block with the wig on, was I had to go to a conference overseas for work, and then I added a holiday onto that, and I spent pretty much a week full time in Scotland, living as Kenna. A bit of time in New York.
Sometimes that's quite important to be able to take those first steps.
To take those first steps, and then after that, coming back home and venturing out more and more, and feeling more comfortable in myself, working out how to proceed.
Very much like you take those steps, and occasionally, and the first time that I ever actually seriously went out in public by myself, drove into the city. Parked at Crown, and sort of went walking into the city, and every time you walk past somebody, you think, oh, they're looking, and your eyes are darting, and you're trying to look, cool, calm, and collected.
About a year ago, I said, okay, it's time that I do this full time. So my two big orbits of life were work. And the involvement with my church. It turned out more by coincidence than anything else, is that I told work, and there was a whole bunch of work in the IT end to do, and record keeping and whatever and that, and so my immediate manager was supportive and said, yes, okay, let's do this, and sort of it'll take IT a week or two. Then I agreed with the minister of my church that we'd come out on Facebook and in the weekly newsletter. It was a very big day when I came out to both the everybody at church and to all my colleagues at work.
So the interesting part is coming out at the church function, because nearly every brand of religion tends to preach against the LGBTI community.
I'm a member of the Uniting Church.
Yes. Probably one of the more liberal.
And they have been incredibly supportive. Relatively early in the piece, I had come out to my minister. With his support, organised a small group of 3 women to be a support team. When I came out on Facebook, on my own Facebook page, everybody has been hugely supportive. I've been really blessed. I haven't had a single negative comment.
As an exercise in being queer publicly, full-time in the process of thinking about transition, was to join Toastmas. But I don't use the organisation to preach trans issues, but if somebody wants to talk to me about it, I'm happy to outline the story of it. I just turn up with no need to explain myself. I'm just there as another person. I found that in me made a big difference to the way I sort of became comfortable with myself.
A couple of months ago, I was asked if I would be willing to nominate to the church council. And a month ago, I was elected to church council.
Yeah. Well, so that's a big boost to have people recognise the skills that you have.
I like to think it is because of my skills. There's undoubtedly a small element of the church wanting to be seen to have diversity represented. But I like to think most of it is the contribution I can bring to it.
the process of groups like Seahorse and Alphabet Soup and other social support groups are there to help the likes of me and you and others become comfortable with themselves so that then they can get on with their life. And that's what I see the value of social supporting, because in many ways, to me, that's much more important than professional support, even though that's very important because ultimately we're social beings and we need to be accepted socially.
And we need to be recognised for who we are.
That's right. What are some of the issues that you find coming out, talking to other trans people and the issues that they're having?
There's a whole variety of stuff, and one of the things that a lot of trans people struggle with is the cost of surgery. And I'm fortunate is that I had some savings and some inheritance to help me through the process. And over the last 6 months, I've been on a bit of a surgical journey for cosmetic surgery, which is fundamental to helping me feel more myself. For me, to an extent, and to other people hugely profoundly, the dysphoria of appearing so contrary to how they feel is huge. And I get angry at both governments, state and federal, for their lack of support of the trans community. At the federal level, Medicare recognises virtually or very few elements of the surgical processes that many trans people go through that are necessary because they're just regarded as cosmetic, and therefore the Commonwealth Government is not interested in allowing Medicare to fund them, which then also, once Medicare funds it, private health insurance will then step in and support hospitals effectively in the private sector. But then there are so many people who can't, even with Medicare support, wouldn't be able to afford that, and this is where the state government comes in, is that there is no public service for surgeries for transgender people. And that would involve a cost of training and supporting surgeons in some of the relevant skills, or allowing some of the others to move forward through to surgery.
Clearly a passion of yours, obviously from both from a personal interest but just collectively for it. But what sort of active part are you playing in trying to work towards having that change?
A lot of it is discussing whenever I have the chance. As I'm getting back to being myself, I wonder whether I should get more actively involved, and I think developing relationships with politicians, possibly with parties.
Support both in terms of the surgery and all that is very important. Fortunately, we got some very good psychological help in the psychiatrists and psychologists around, and I know just from the people I've met over the last 20 years, there's a lot of very talented people who advocate for better conditions for trans people, but it's still a long way to go.
The social change behind that really requires some openness and willingness to launch into that by politicians at various levels, through both levels of government. And I'm not seeing that. Both state and federal seem to be, in many issues, just trying to maintain the status quo. And I would like to think that there is some more vision and leadership out there. But
in the last few years, you've really come to terms with who you are, and you're putting in place that your personal support. When you now reflect upon your whole life, what are those areas now that you see that you missed that might have made a difference?
Relationships. I never felt genuinely comfortable enough in myself to independently form relationships. And I guess also a lot of my life I've learnt to squash emotions. And I am now gaining confidence in myself and beginning to form relationships and really trying to give space to experience emotions rather than sort of squashing them down and saying that's not appropriate. Emotions are appropriate, and I need to get into that more. The two areas of growth that I've missed out on that I'm open to exploring, and hence in my transition process I've been jumping into it quicker than many younger people who I know who can take good number of years over it. I've started late and I'm racing to catch up.
As I mentioned about my being involved with Toastmasters was just being there for the same reason as everyone else, and therefore not have to explain. So it's up to other people. Just in any other environment, you walk into a room or walk down the street, you see all sorts of people, and how you interact with somebody else because they look a bit different to me, and vice versa, is that they come into the environment I'm in. It's up to them as somebody who's coming along for the same reason as me. I'm here to learn how to speak in public or to conduct a meeting, and and I found that it's sort of like teaching via osmosis in some ways.
And some of it's osmosis, and I take this step, which you do indirectly. I probably do a little bit more directly occasionally, and say to a person, yes, I am trans, because I am fairly presentable, and I like to think that being a presentable, ordinary person who in my parlance just blends into the normal population of women, to say that, yes, okay, I am just this ordinary person who and oh, you're trans, is a part of it. So that's the direction that I take there.
It's a lovely note to finish on, I think, is that acceptance by others that you are just who you are, regardless.
Yeah.
So thank you, Kenna, for participating in the conversation tonight.
Pleasure.
My guest has been Kenna Morrison. I'm Greer McGeary. Thank you for watching Ben TV.